Hello everyone. Today we'd like to do a design tutorial on how to improve as a designer in PGA 2K21. So this tutorial will be useful for anyone who's new to course design, as well as anyone who's had a little bit of practice but still don't feel like they're very good at it yet, or that their courses aren't turning out very well yet. It might also be useful for more established designers as well, who might feel like their courses have plateaued and they would like to step up another couple notches perhaps. So the simplest way of improving that you hear everyone say is practice, right? Practice a lot, put lots of time into the designer, make lots of courses, and practice is obviously super useful, and will always have a huge value for improvement, but just practicing is not entirely the whole picture. You want your practice to be as effective as possible and as efficient as possible, so that you can improve with a purpose. Practicing works best when you have a specific thing that you are working towards, a specific thing that you are trying to improve. Because practicing on its own just makes you better at what you're practicing. And if what you're practicing isn't necessarily the best thing to be practicing, it can actually make you worse. So today we're going to break down course design into 5 different skills, distinct skills that are all required to make a good golf course, and we're going to talk about each of those skills one at a time. So the first one that we're going to talk about is routing. So routing your course. There's a few different aspects we can talk about when we think of routing our course. Here I'm in the designer for my new course called Logfell Lake, which is fairly late in development, not quite ready yet, but we'll be using this as an example to start off with. So the first thing you can see about the routing is the composition. So the composition of the routing is what is your final par for the course, how many par 3s, how many par 4s, how many par 5s, and also what types of par 3s, par 4s, par 5s. So here we have, this course is a standard 72 par, but it has 5 par 3s and 5 par 5s. So the composition there is a little bit different than your traditional 4 3s, 4 4s, and or 4 5s and 10 par 4s. And just wanted to try something a little bit different to see how that would impact the play of the course. So how I did it was, on the front 9 I would have 3 par 3s, and on the back 9 I would have 3 par 5s. So front 9 has par 3 here, par 3 here, and par 3 here. Yeah, with your standard 2 par 5s on 9 and 4. The placement of where you put your par 3s and your par 5s can also kind of change how the routing feels. And the flow of your routing. So a course should flow quite nicely together, right? And the composition of the holes that you choose determines that as well. So here we start out with a mid-length par 4. I'll flip it here. Yeah, so pretty standard type of hole to start a golf course on. It's kind of your first introduction to the course and should give you an idea for how the course is going to play. So easing people into the experience. Second one is on the lake, a little bit shorter, not quite drivable. Maybe with a heavy tailwind you could, but it's getting harder. And then we go into a par 3, so longer par 3, again a little bit harder, and then a shorter par 5. So kind of start easy, get a little bit harder, and if you put a couple things that are a bit harder, a bit riskier in a row, then it's nice to break it up with something a bit easier, like a shorter par 5, or this one's kind of, I guess, mid-length par 5. It's still on the shorter side. It's drivable. Yeah. So the composition of your course. How many par 3s, par 4s, par 5s, and where they're placed is quite important. One of the kind of things I've done that's a little bit out of the ordinary is have 9 as a par 5 to end the front 9, and 10 as a par 5 to start the back 9. So the key there is to make them feel quite different. 9 is much shorter than 10. 9 plays uphill, 10 is a bit flatter. And then we go to a short par 4 after. So we've had 2 long holes, and then we go to a short hole. Yeah. So the other things to consider when we're talking about routing, we've talked so far about composition and flow, is the land use. So when we look at the kind of general idea for this course is that there's a central lake. It's kind of a long lake, and the course is going to start at one end of the lake, go up the side of the lake, kind of crosses over here for a little bit, but essentially goes up one side of the lake and back down the other side and ends back at the clubhouse area. So the land use here is that if the central kind of theme of the course is this lake, that we want the golf course to be interacting with this lake as much as possible. So we've tried to route it to stay pretty close to the lake, and even on holes that are away from the lake, you can still prominently see the lake as you're playing it. So it's still part of the character of that hole. Right? If we look at how compact this routing is in general, if you look at just in terms of the whole plot, it takes up a fairly large amount of the plot. So it's not super tight on its own. Each hole kind of has its own space to play, but it's still not super spread out, right? Say if you're on this green, you're close to this green. You can see this hole in front of you. The tee deck for the next hole is right there. You know, if you look across, you can see this hole. From this hole, you're next to this one, right? It's relatively tight that way, but not super, super condensed. If you do have a very limited space or are trying to build in a very limited space, you will need to make your course much more condensed that way, which adds some challenges to it as well, but it also adds a lot of benefits too. A much tighter, more compact course means you don't have nearly as much to plant. Like this course has a lot of areas that need to be planted, and we've started on most of them. Everywhere has some planting at least, but it still needs a lot more. Now, if this course was much more open, right, I could have easily say from 3, put 4 further out into the woods here, you know, and if I had a golf hole out here, I'd be very far away from the lake, which means my next hole is still pretty far away from the lake. And it would kind of meander away from the main elements that define what the course is. So that routing wouldn't quite work as well. Yeah, so you want to think of whether your course needs to be more compact to make it better, or sometimes maybe space it out a little bit to fit the environment better. You can also see that because there's a central lake, the land away from the lake kind of slowly moves up to higher ground away from the lake, right? Like 9 is a good example. You start on the water and it slowly moves up away. So the general terrain of this area dictates what type of hole it is. So 12, you're crossing the lake, but then kind of going up the hill away from the lake. 13, you're going slightly downhill back towards the lake, right? And then because it's not quite at the water's edge, it's still raised up in the air, right? 7 is much lower, closer to the water's edge. But that actually makes for quite a nice view from this screen. Yes, the land is generally kind of sloping towards the water, and that makes it much easier to read what fairways and stuff are doing. Like these few holes here kind of go up the hill away from the lake to this little stream, and then that kind of sets us up for our grand finale coming back down towards the water. Yeah, so land use with your routing is quite important as well. Last thing we'll say about routing is you kind of want to design your routing for creating memorable moments as well, to kind of have an ebb and flow to the overall experience, right? We talked briefly about how 1 is a fairly straightforward mid-length par 4. And really the experience is more just to introduce you to the golf course. You kind of come through this corridor of trees, and on your approach shot you get to see the whole lake and a whole bunch of different holes that you're going to be playing, right? So that's a good kind of opening hole. You remember that because you get that visual of what the whole course is laid out in front of you, right? So that works well as a beginning hole. If this were the closing hole, it would feel quite underwhelming, because there's nothing terribly special about it. It's not one of the harder holes, it's not one of the easier holes. It doesn't really have any crazy features. It just kind of has a basic sort of layout that kind of tells you what the style of the course is going to be. So for a closing hole, we have this downhill par 5, very reachable. The hazards, you see there's way more of them. We have a lot more scattered bunkers. The view of the lake, it gives you one last look down at the water of the lake. There's a lot more danger as you're coming a lot closer to the lake. And so this is a much more exciting kind of closing hole. There's opportunities to make very aggressive plays and go for eagle, or to just try and protect your score and save par. And then throughout the round, right, you kind of want to make a few other moments in the middle as well, right? Like, you know, say these two greens next to each other. You get onto this green and you're like, oh, okay, I see that there. I can look forward to it. And then when you're playing down towards it, you see that green and you see the clubhouse and you go, oh yeah, I was right there, right? The whole time we can see 18 green complex and look forward to playing that. You know, this par 3 here is I find a memorable hole, as you can see a lot of really nice visuals. We're looking into the sunlight. You can still see interesting things in the background. The pin's kind of silhouetted by the water. Yeah, so kind of having a few sort of more memorable moments mid-round so that people can kind of have benchmarks as they're going. The whole time on the course, you can see the clubhouse in the distance. Well, not every single shot, but at some point on each hole, you can still see the clubhouse to help orient yourself. You can always see where the lake is to orient yourself. So you kind of have a feeling of progress as you go around the golf course. Yeah, so that's a bit of a discussion on routing, some things to consider. And let's move on to another design skill we'll talk about, which is surfacing. And these skills aren't really in any particular order of importance. Each person will place each of these skills at a slightly different importance to each other. But yeah, the next one we talk about is surfacing. So main thing to start out with is how we place surfaces, right? We can use splines, which I've done pretty much on everything on this course, or you can use shapes, right? Yeah, so we have all of these surfaces, right? I could use a brush and kind of use these shapes to create them as well. So when deciding how you want to place your surfaces, it needs to be determined by the style of course you want. So this style of course is supposed to be quite smooth, quite manicured. You can see the bunker style is quite rounded, kind of smaller bunkers, generally pretty smooth, right? So it works best for splines, you know, edges of the rough even relatively smooth. If you were going for, say, a rugged dunes type course, then using brushes may make for a much better look. So getting good at using both brushes and splines is quite important. Then also when we're talking about surfacing, the sizing of how we make our surfaces. So here you might notice as we're looking around the course, on this course the greens are relatively small. They're a smaller style of green. They're not super big. Like 18 is probably one of the bigger ones. And if we measure it, it's still not overly big. Yeah, 30 by 40 we'll say, roughly. Whereas, say, a few of the other ones are 30 in length, but much, much narrower. So yeah, 20 to even 15. Yeah, so these are relatively small greens, right? So the size of these surfaces. Now, if you know that you're designing smaller greens, then you have to plan for how those are going to work. If we look at the length of this course, it comes well under 7,000 yards, so it's a fairly short course. So that makes slightly smaller greens work a bit better. You also notice a lot of these greens have slopes that help you get onto the green. This one's a little bit of a shorter hole. So that doesn't necessarily work, but like you see these ones, a bit of a kind of punch bowl on the side here helps you get onto that green. Yeah, this one's kind of similar to hole 1 with a bit of a kicker slope here, a bit of a backstop there. Most of these fairways you can land short and roll onto the green, so that helps you with your shorter, with slightly smaller greens. Yeah, and a lot of times you're coming into these greens with shorter clubs. Right. Yeah. So if you are planning to make very large greens or very small greens or medium-sized greens, then they have to suit the design of your course. They have to suit the difficulty of your course as well. But having them be quite consistent is important. So that's just kind of the sizing of the greens. We talk about the fairways as well. Fairways are a little bit on the narrower side also. So this is kind of the biggest sort of layup area of this hole, and it's 40 yards wide. Most of these fairways can be 25 or 30 yards wide. So I've made them quite narrow as well. So that's just the style of course I've decided. So here is 40 yards wide. Here is a bit wider. Put that brush inside. Yeah, but you see this part play is narrower because of this slope that pushes everything to the outside. Yeah, so looking at how the slopes change the effective playable area of a hole or fairway. Like if you go back to 1 here, it's definitely one of the narrower fairways. So the layup area here is only 30. If you are laying back up to there, you're probably using a hybrid or long iron. So a bit easier to hit that target, but you'll see this slope kicks everything onto the fairway. This little mound kind of helps keep it on the fairway as well. But if you're going for more distance here, this slope helps you get onto the fairway, right? You can miss right and still bounce onto the fairway. But that slope continues, so this side of the fairway doesn't really help you. So this is a much riskier sort of landing zone than this one. And yeah, the sizing of those surfaces is kind of determined by your strategy, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Last thing we'll talk about for surfacing is how they interact with each other. So say bunkers, right? How close are they going to be to your playable surfaces? So this bunker kind of matches the curve of the green. Not perfectly, but close to it. You see these ones, they kind of match into the shapes of the fairway and the green, right? So how they interact with the surfaces around them is quite good. You know, if this bunker was placed way out here, there'd be this large space in between the bunker and the fairway, and that would kind of make them interact a little bit oddly. One of the main ones that's quite important is if you're connecting two surfaces together, you want to have really smooth transitions. So you can see how this transition matches into the green there, how it matches into the green there, making those transitions quite smooth. And on different courses you may have to match those transitions into other types of surfaces as well, like light rough for instance. But yeah, thinking about how the surfaces interact with each other is also quite important. Yeah. Right. So that's all we'll talk about for surfacing for now. Move on to another skill, which will be strategy. So we've kind of started to talk a little bit about it when we were talking about the sizing of our surfaces. Strategy is what we need to think about when we're designing the playability of the hole. So here's a longer par 3. Yeah, plays 219 from the tips. It's slightly downhill, but not significantly so. And so the strategy here, right, we have a green that's gently sloping down towards the water. The whole hole is sloping down towards the water. So this green is a bit further away, and it's quite hard to stick, right? So your strategy options are we going to try and land it on the green and get it to stop, which maybe for some of these back pins may work fine. But if you're going for something like these shorter pins, or even this one in the middle, landing it further back may be a better option, right? The slopes kind of move right to left here. So say for this pin 1 position, landing it just behind the bunker, kind of on the right hand side, works well. And so that comes out through the choices that people have to make, right? When you're talking about strategy, really you're talking about what choices the golfers have to make. And so here, going for the green, landing short of the green, and what sort of risks you're willing to take, right? If you go short but aim left, you'll kind of get funneled into this sort of area here. If you try and go for the green long and bounce off the back, you could end up in the bunker. You can end up on this slope over here. Yeah, so thinking about the choices that they have to make. And most of those choices are dictated by the width and the angles. So let's look at 7 here. 7 is kind of a good example to show kind of what we mean by width and angles, as well a bit of risk reward. So our tee off on 7 here, we're looking across the water. This whole dog leg's to the right. It's a bit longer of a par 4, so playing 467. So what sort of approach shot you leave yourself is going to be important. Now if we look at the green, it slopes towards the water, but it has kind of 2 tiers. This first tier is the higher one, and back tier is a bit lower. Everything kind of slopes front left to back right. So the angles that you pick can be quite difficult, right? If you were trying to go for this pin back here, or this harder one, I believe that's pin 4, and you're coming in from, this angle, you're staring straight at this bunker. The green slopes a little bit away from you, so it'll be quite hard to stick, right? So instead, if you put your drive up here, then you're looking at a bit more open space here. You can land it there and let it roll down into it. It's a much friendlier angle to approach this. So making sure that you are giving people the option to pick their angle into the green is quite important for strategy. Now say a pin like this, right, coming in from angle over here may not be quite as good because it's sloping left to right, and the main difficulty is going to be to get it to stop before it gets to this slope here, right? So maybe if you can clear this corner to there, that would be a really good spot to aim for that pin. Or you can even lay back to here, and that would still give you a pretty good angle to that pin. Yeah. You'll also notice that for the amount of risk that you want to take on, the dangers kind of match that, right? So one of the things I was trying to achieve for this course is to make the strategy so that you don't have to go near the water if you don't want to, right? So putting the ball up here is a perfectly fine strategy for any of those pin locations. It gives you slightly worse off for some of these higher ones. But that's the choice, right? Is a safer option here going to be worthwhile for a slightly harder approach shot? Whereas this spot, if you look at the top of the screen, it's about 295 to clear to this part of the fairway. So really only reachable in favorable conditions, and quite dangerous if you're trying to go for it, right? If you put it to the right, you're going to bounce off this into the water. Short, you're going to bounce into the water or sit in this kind of rough ledge here. The bunkers makes quite a tricky kind of long bunker shot. So tons of danger there, right? The widest landing area is kind of in front of the bunkers here. So this is kind of the safest sort of layup zone. And this is kind of just a tail, really, for if you have heavy, heavy winds. Mainly visual fairway back here, but again, it's a little bit wider if someone did have to hit it here. In real life, you would have to make kind of the start of the fairway here, probably a bit wider, just because a lot of golfers hit quite short. Yeah, but in this video game, realistically, no one's going to be hitting shorter than probably here, unless they have a ridiculously strong headwind, right? So this whole area is fairly wide. The dangers are more to the right, right? So if you're playing to the left side, fairly safe. I mean, putting it in the rough back here is no fun, but at least you still have a decent angle. It's not the end of the world. You can still make par here fine, right? Yeah, so the width determines where people, or how people can use the angles to approach the green. And the hazards are placed to add more risk to the more beneficial shots. Like if you can clear the pond to here, that's great for those pins. It's not the greatest angle for these ones, But if you have a good tailwind, you can clear the pond and get it up here. Now we have a really, really good location for those back pins. So I've talked about for strategy, width and angles, risk and reward. And the last thing we'll talk about is difficulty and balancing. So originally when you're thinking about what type of course you want to build, thinking of the difficulty of that course is important and keeping that relatively consistent. When I think of balancing the difficulty, I like to think of it as making sure that each shot matters towards your overall score. So if we break it down more, difficulty will be how hard the course plays. So this course, we already know it's a slightly shorter course. Like this hole 7 is probably one of the longer holes, par 4s. But most of the holes are playing kind of on the shorter side. Like this is the only par 5 of all of the par 5s that is a 3-shot par 5. It's over 600 yards. But even this one I have actually managed to reach by placing a perfect drive here and then hitting driver again to this area and having it roll on. So even that can be reached. I have quite a short par 5 here, which has tons of dangers. So this is a much shorter course in general, which means for the difficulty, that alone is going to make the course play a little bit easier. So we can add a lot more difficulty through hazards, through hole design, through kind of the widths that we're leaving players to hit from. Like this being a short par 5, you have some pretty treacherous landing zones off the tee. You have a really treacherous approach. This green is not super friendly for balls that are coming in from a distance. So it still plays fairly hard, even though it's a short par 5. Right? So those are all decisions to help balance the difficulty of the course. That each hole should be relatively similar in difficulty. Now I would say if every single hole is exactly the same in difficulty, then that may not be very interesting either. So kind of thinking of how the course is going to play and adding slightly more difficulty in some areas, slightly less in others, can really dictate kind of the experience of the course. So say the closing stretch on this course, 15 through to 18. This is a drivable par 4, tons of risk. The difficulty here is not really reaching the green. The difficulty is in if you mess up your shot, you get punished really hard, right? Whereas a longer hole, say this one's not super long, but really any of your misses here aren't going to be terribly, terribly punishing. You can probably save par with a bad tee shot or a bad approach shot. You know, you could chip up and down. Par is quite reasonable for every hole on this golf course. The more risks you take, the more chances you have of getting birdies, but also the more chances you have of getting bogeys or double bogeys with putting the ball in the water. Yeah, so this is a drivable par 4, tons of risk. You could get anywhere from eagle to double bogey quite easily on that hole. This is a short par 5, which may be underestimated and could end up with some bogeys, but it is definitely another eagle chance, but definitely not an easy eagle chance. This par 3, because those two holes are pretty intense, taking on lots of danger. This one, we keep the green a little bit away from the danger. this lake is more of a visual danger unless you're trying to aim kind of short and you spray one quite far off that way. But yeah, this hole's a little bit easier just to give people a chance to catch their breath after those two pretty intense holes. Still, if you look at the slopes of the green, they're subtle, but they can funnel you away from the pin position you want. So this is definitely not an easy birdie either, but it should be an easy par. And then 18 is probably, I think it'll probably end up being the easiest hole on the course as a exciting finish. Even from back here, you can still make the green in two. And, you know, if you do put it through the mouth of the fairway, you can end up with a reasonable eagle putt. Now, it being one of the bigger greens, that eagle putt could be quite long, depending on which pin you're playing. So still not a guarantee, but this should be a fairly easy hole to birdie, unless you somehow put it in the water or have some trouble with the bunkers, for instance. Yeah, so thinking about the difficulty of the course, keeping it relatively consistent and balancing that difficulty throughout. So one other aspect of balancing the difficulty of the course is from tee to green, right? If you have always really easy drives and really hard greens, then what that ends up with is that because all the difficulty on any given hole is on the green, then it doesn't matter as much what happens off of the drive necessarily. What matters is that your chipping and putting is going really well. So you may end up not caring so much about what happens to your drive, because you may do everything perfectly, get onto the green in a relatively good spot, and still 2 or 3 putt, right? So the opposite could be said as well. A super easy green with a really hard fairway might not feel super balanced either, because with a hard fairway, right, even if you end up in one of the hazards, but you can still put it on the green. If the green is super easy, then it doesn't really matter where you are on the green. Like, you can have a relatively similar chance of making a 30-foot putt as you do a 20-foot putt if the greens are really flat and easy. So trying to make each shot matter in terms of how important a good shot is towards scoring well on that hole can keep you engaged throughout the entire round. Yeah, so there's some things about strategy. Strategy is a super deep topic that people have spent their whole lives dedicating to. So one of the harder skills to get good at, but definitely a really important one. So let's move on to another skill. This skill will be sculpting. Let's bring up the sculpting tool. So the main two things that you use is landscape flatten and landscape raise. And so getting good with these two functions is quite important. When we're thinking of sculpting, when we first design a plot, you want to think of the larger land movements that you need to make. So kind of designing all of your bigger sort of hills and things, right? You may need to make say a giant hill back here, right? To kind of get the overall kind of land movement of the course that you're looking for, right? You know, when I started this plot, I dug down the lake first and then kind of raised up the surrounding terrain to kind of make it how I wanted, with just kind of big sort of brushes like this. And I kept them relatively smooth, so I used the flatten mostly. For other courses with a lot more rugged scenery, like my other course, Little Cliff Mountain, I used a lot of the raise feature to make it as rugged as possible. I'll just quickly show kind of a good way of making slightly more rugged features. Let's go way into the back of the plot here. So this is one of my favorite brushes for rugged features. I'll just raise it up a little bit. Do a little bit, you can either hold it or you can fast click. Right, so that already makes it a little bit more rugged, and you can just do a few layers of that. It'll slowly get higher and higher and more rugged. Right, if I make it smaller, then it'll get even more rugged. Right, and we're starting to create a more rugged, kind of hilly terrain. So those are some differences for how to make it more rugged, more smooth, right? If I don't want that to be super rugged, I can fix it with the flatten tool, smooth it out. Right, so then we have a smoother hill in the background here. And there's a bunch of different ways of doing it. You can do single clicks in strategic places, or you can hold and move it around, or you can even fast click when sculpting terrain as well. So the difference between holding down the button and fast clicking the button is when you hold it down, say here I have it at 8 feet, nothing will go above 8 feet that I pressed on. But if I'm fast clicking, well, that still worked the same. Yeah, but usually when you're fast clicking, I think it's more with the raise tool. You can end up with them stacking, and you can get some really high or really low things that way. So they work slightly differently. But being able to use both is good. So it's kind of larger features. You start with all your large features first when sculpting a plot, and then say the point where I am on this course is now looking at smaller details. So I have the general slopes and stuff that I want, but say, for instance, these bunkers don't quite look right yet. So sculpting them to get them to look exactly how I want, get the depths right, how high the faces are, can make them look a lot better. So smaller sculpting. Yeah, so already that bunker looks much nicer than it did before. I'll probably end up working on that a bit more as we go, but don't want to spend too much time on it now. Same with like green sculpting, being able to do really subtle sculpting changes to get the greens exactly how you want them. Right, so this green I haven't finalized yet. It kind of has the general shapes I want to it. One thing that I'm looking at is I've got a yellow kind of shelf, and I don't necessarily, we can even see that this shelf is sloping down into kind of a trough here. So that's something that I don't necessarily want. I kind of want a more smooth slope down to here. And that's just for the style of this course. On other types of courses, you may want this ridge to be even sharper. Yeah. So the smaller kind of green sculpting movements are super tricky to get good at, to get exactly what you want. Can make a huge difference for how your greens play. I like to try and make sure that my greens are very easy to read. So meaning that the beads all move in the same sort of direction in certain areas. So I don't like to see a ton of chaos with the beads going in every which direction. So that move I made here, I raised it outside of the green because I wanted to get rid of that little dip here. So now I have this pin on a red slope, which I also don't want, but we smooth it out. And we should get back to kind of the similar look that we had before, but now with no trough there. Yeah, green sculpting is super, super hard to get good at, and one of those things that you can keep improving for a very, very long time. Yeah, so we're almost to what we want. This pin's on a yellow slope. We prefer for it to be on a green slope. And this, right now, I'm just using the flatten tool. See, now if we look at all these beads, they should all be going kind of up to the left. There's some here that are coming to the right, but that's mainly because this is sloped down this way. Yes. And this yellow slope is a little bit mellower as well too. We could end up using the raise tool to fix some of these things as well. Right, so if I were to use the flatten brush on this point here, what would happen is that it would end up raising the ground here. So I quite like how mellow the slope is around the pin there, so I don't really want to mess with that. But I do want to kind of soften this slope slightly. So I make it small enough that the blue brush is not in this flat section, it's still on the slope. And I just lower just slightly. Now there's still the glitch that doesn't show you the actual height in inches, but I've only clicked kind of lower twice, so should only be a couple inches dropping this each time. So you can see this is mellowing out the slope without changing this nice flat section here. So this is really key for balancing the difficulty of your greens as well, because yeah, even the slightest change in slope around or on your hole will drastically increase the difficulty of it. So this is kind of the final thing that I do for balancing the difficulty, is doing one last go over of the greens to make sure that the difficulty for each pin is how I want it, that all the slopes are working how I want it. And so I kind of switch back and forth between the flatten and the raise tool quite a lot during this process. So I've kind of lowered this shelf a little bit how I wanted to, but now it's kind of lumpy and stuff, so now I'm going to use this tool to smooth it back out. Yeah, so there we have more of kind of what I wanted. A gentle kind of slope here, not really a tier. Yeah, this slope might still be a little too sharp near this pin. So we'll mellow that out a bit more. Yeah, so we're starting to get closer to what we want. So, talking about sculpting, there's kind of bigger sculpting kind of large things like the plot of land. Maybe, you know, if I'm on my approach here and I can't see the green, maybe I need to, you know, lower this whole section of the fairway just so that I can see better. So you get bigger sculpting changes like that. And then much smaller sculpting changes for slopes on greens, making the bunkers look right, making the fairways look right, roll properly, that sort of thing. Yeah, so the last thing we'll talk about with the sculpting is sculpting off of the playable surfaces, so how you want your surroundings to look, right? So these hills, they're a little lumpy and bumpy, but overall fairly smooth, and that's kind of the style I wanted for the background. Then say in an area like this, I made this rocky outcropping, so sculpting behind it here has made the ground a lot more rugged to bring out this sort of rocky texture. So depending on what kind of course you want, you may do a lot of this type of sculpting in the background, or you may just make a nice kind of smooth background surface, smooth hills, or just flat around the course. So getting good at making this rugged sculpting look really good is quite hard. One thing about the rugged sculpting in this game is that if you raise more than, say, I think it's about 10 feet, it really stretches the textures and it looks quite bad. Yeah, so you see the difference between this mound, it's already kind of stretching, but if you were to do it again, that's super stretched and looks quite bad. So, if we want to make, say, this little rock pile look better, I like to kind of make a really small brush and kind of chew away at it, so no one point on this surface is longer than, say, about 10 feet, and that will make the textures look much more natural and much more rugged. And there are some ways of doing this a little bit faster than just with a small brush, but this is just to kind of demonstrate how to make these textures look a little bit better. Yeah, so say here, right, the bottom has got a little bit of grass, but it's rocky. And then these textures aren't really stretched. This one might be a little bit. You can maybe do one more click there. But yeah, this face looks a lot better just because none of the textures are stretched. Whereas this side, a bit more stretched there. So thinking about that when you do rugged sculpting, you got to work around the limitations of the designer to make it look quite nice. And you can always soften these things out by taking the flattened brush and just mellowing things out. Yeah, I don't actually want this little mound to be here, so I'm going to drop it all the way down. But yeah, sculpting is quite hard to get good at as well, just because it's not super intuitive in this designer, and sloppy sculpting takes you out of the experience pretty quickly. I'd say that's the biggest difference between a good and a great course is the sculpting, like making sure that the bunkers sit nicely, that the fairways flow fairly smoothly, that the greens have kind of smooth rolls, stuff to them, right? Like, say if we're looking at this green, we can see everything's kind of moving left to right, so really smooth, predictable, easy to read. And that'll be a fun surface to putt on. Now, the one thing that lots of people get frustrated with is they're like, okay, this grid looks really good, that's exactly what I want, and then they'll play and it will look completely different. So the reason for that is that the grid is aligned one certain direction in the designer and it never changes, but when you're putting it will realign always to your putt. So I'm going to go completely diagonal to this grid. I have to remember which pin this is, pin 3. And so if I go here, diagonal to this pin, I set pin 3, press play from here, now it will realign with my putt, and we'll look at the exact same thing with the whole grid aligned diagonally. And so this is how you can check really what's going on with your green, is check from multiple angles. Sometimes yellow, orange, red slopes will show up from one angle and not another. So here, this is starting to go a little bit yellow, this downhill slope, whereas we didn't see that with the grid aligned the other way. This also shows that the slope goes back to front a little bit, which is interesting. It also kind of shows that this ridge here, there's kind of a higher point here that comes back down. So there's a little bit of a dip there, which I didn't notice from the other side. So that's something that maybe I don't really like. I might fix that. But yeah, looking at your green from different angles is quite important to knowing exactly how the sculpting on your green works. See, I'll go back to the editor and I'll realign the original way. Well, and put my camera way over. Right? And here we see no yellow slopes. Oh, this is starting to go a little bit yellow that way, but not as noticeable. Can we tell if this ridge is there? Yeah, a little bit. It's definitely more noticeable from the other angle. Right. So, that's sculpting. And one last skill we'll talk about is the visuals. So, this is what people see when they're looking at your course. And different designers place the value of the visuals much higher than others. Some people don't care about visuals, they just want the course to play really well. Other people don't really care how the course plays, as long as it's functional, and they just want to use the course as a way of showing off their beautiful artworks. Like my clubhouse is probably one of the nicer things that I've designed, right? But really the best courses do the visuals very well as alongside the strategy of the course and the playability of the course. So some things to keep in mind for visuals is, one thing, you want the environment to be believable. You want it to work together. So this environment, there's a lake, right? Everything in the environment goes along with that. We have lots of kind of deadish sort of trees, lots of logs floating in the water. We have little kind of swampy areas. There are some rock piles where, you know, rocks in the ground would have been moved while putting in fairways or green sites. You know, you got these sort of rock piles that are moved away from the playable surfaces. But everything in the environment fits that theme. Now, the other thing with making the environment believable is asking yourself whether it could exist in real life. So there are no super sharp drops. Say, you know, if I want to walk from one green to 2T, yeah, these T's are just placeholders at the moment, but this is a reasonable terrain to walk on. I may even actually raise this spot up slightly, just to make that a little bit better. But yeah, this whole environment works in real life, right? You can walk to the fairway, you can walk to the next tee. For crossing the lakes, I've made these little retaining wall walkway bridges. Yeah, and there's nothing too unrealistic that takes you out of the experience. This is somewhere that could exist in real life. Now, some environments, you know, can be more interesting than others, right? You can make a very believable environment by just placing a giant forest on a flat piece of ground, right? But that may not actually look that interesting. So one thing to think of when making things look interesting is your sight lines. From a playability standpoint, you want to be able to see what you're playing. So here we look at the sight line from the tee here, so we can see the fairway bunker, we can see the green kind of down the hill in the distance, we can see the lake behind it. So we can see what we're trying to play. You know, from the approach shot, we can see the green sitting below us, we can see the bunker there, and then we can start to see the backdrop a lot more. So sightlines can be very practical from a playability standpoint, or they can be purely visual to enhance the experience, right? So when you come into this screen, you see the lake behind you. Is kind of your first introduction to this lake. So it should be a really nice visual moment. So tried to keep kind of behind the green relatively clean so that your eye focuses more on things in the distance, right? Like hole 2. You can see this little green island, hole 15. If you look over to your left, you can see 18 green sight. And of course, when you're putting on the green, then you can look back up at the clubhouse patio. So we've got good sight lines all over the place for visuals. You can even see the creek going up 16. You can see those bunkers, fairway bunkers on 16. So the sight lines are super important as well. So here, you know, you can see all of your bunkers, which is really important. You can see what the hazards are. But then also from this green, we get a preview of hole 5 green and can kind of see the par 3 6th up there. And so all of these sight lines were created on purpose. In fact, when I was starting to plant, I would actually take the measuring tool and make sight lines that I wanted to see. So say for instance, if I was on 8 green, I would still want to be able to see the clubhouse area, right? And so I'd place a bunch of these measuring tools to make sure that I had these sight lines cleared. Like I think probably one of the craziest ones is this one here. You can still see the clubhouse through the woods from this screen. Whereas if I was kind of just mindlessly planting, probably would have blocked it. Sight lines from the 13th green is one that I really like, right? So I made sure you could still see 7th green. You could still see across to 11th. 8 green. You could see up 9 fairway. You could see 6 green sight, kind of. It's a bit more in the distance. You can even look really far in the back to see this 4th green sight. It's a little bit further, harder to see, but you can see down 14. You can see the clubhouse, which also starts to show you you can see the 18th green. Yeah, so all of these sight lines are designed to make sure that you can always orient yourself on the course and just to enhance the visual experience of it. So that's some talk about the sight lines, making a believable sort of environment. And then the last aspect of it is the planting, how you plant your course. So kind of having an idea for how you want the planting to look before starting, or kind of setting it fairly early in the design is a good idea. So I knew I wanted lots of dead logs, dead trees, so I pulled in a bunch of these dead sycamores. I've used these logs in a bunch of various ways. I've got tons of stumps and things, right, like especially in this sort of area. Yeah, and I knew I wanted to kind of make rocky outcroppings, and so I have a general theme for the planting of the course, but it's not exactly the same everywhere on the course. So I find this to be super key, is you want memorable areas of the course that look slightly different to each other, like say this creek coming down the hill here. Right? This makes for a unique area of the course, but it doesn't feel out of place compared to the rest of the course, because it still has a lot of the same visual elements. You still have rocky outcropping behind, you still get planting with lots of kind of dead trees and logs around. right? So it fits the environment, but it's not exactly the same everywhere. And I find that's really nice for making each hole feel like its own experience and giving you a sense of progress as you go around the course, right? Like say this tee shot, you make it up over here and you see this kind of swampy sort of pond, right? It's quite visually distinct compared to other places on the course. So it's kind of like a landmark that you can see as you go around the course. Yeah, planting is quite a tricky skill as well to do right. I tend to take a few more liberties with trying some weird things, stuff like some more giant logs I've used to kind of make these gnarled tree roots here for this giant oak tree, right? So this is slightly more on the fantasy side of planting, but still not completely unrealistic. It fits the reality of this environment. Yeah. So that's a bit of talk about the visuals for your course. Find the best courses. Yeah. Use the visuals to enhance the playability of the course. There is definitely a point where too much is too much. And I would say that's mainly if you're starting to kind of block the main views that you need to play courses well. Or kind of crowd it out so you can't automatically tell what you're supposed to be looking at. Right? Like off of this tee here, you can see these bunkers, so that kind of gives you a clear guideline that the direction you're trying to go, and then you can see the green site kind of behind those. So immediately off the tee, you kind of know what your options are for shooting off of that tee, and then everything in the background is meant to enhance that experience. But you can see the strategy of the hole right as soon as that tee off opens or loads up. Yeah, so those are 5 different skills, course design skills. All of these skills can be improved on their own and together, and all really, really good golf courses should have good aspects of each of these skills. So the overall goal of this video is to give you an idea for how to improve quickly when you want to make your courses better. So the best way of kind of doing that is to break course design into several different skills and various aspects of these skills. And that way you can look at any particular course and say, okay, these are the skills that I've done well. These are the ones that I have not done very well. And you can then pick the ones that you're not good at and you can practice those. So this is how you improve quickly, is by making sure you identify your weaknesses. Maybe you have a hard time doing that on your own. You might need to get some feedback from someone else to help you with that. But it's equally as important to know what your strengths are. Right? So for me, consistent feedback on all of my courses is that the environments are really interesting and engaging and fun. And so I know that's one thing that I can do particularly well. So at the moment I'm focusing more on strategy, making the slopes really smooth, making the bunkers really smooth, bunker placement. Yeah, so working on parts of the design that I'm not particularly good at yet. So every time I'm in the designer, I pick one of those skills, and even kind of smaller aspects of those skills, and I try and get better at it. Like if you know you're bad at shaping bunkers, just go into the designer, put a ton of bunkers down the side of a fairway, and try and shape them really nice. You know, you don't have to keep that design. It's just for practice. Most designers will have tons of projects that they never end up finishing or just straight up delete, and that's totally fine. As long as you're trying different styles and things, you can improve them, right? If you're only working on one course that has a very particular style, then that's the only thing you'll get good at, right? So practicing the things that you're not good at, even if it's on just a practice plot or a course that you probably won't ever release, will improve your design overall. And usually when I'm working on a project for a length of time, by the time I finish the project, I'm already a lot better at some of the skills that the things that I designed at the start of the project don't match the quality of the things that I design at the end of the project. So that's a good sign that you're improving, but then also you may have to redo stuff to make it up to the same level as the rest of your work. Yeah, so I hope that helps you guys in your designs to think of how can I keep improving. If you know what your weaknesses are but don't know how to improve them, so say the sizing of greens, for instance, or the shape of the greens, like, you know, maybe you get feedback over and over that that's not as good as it could be, then learning what is good is really important. So there are lots of tutorials for very specific aspects of design that will help to learn different aspects of each skill. And also the design community is really friendly in that you can ask most designers questions either when they're streaming or in forums or in comment sections on YouTube, and you'll get some pretty useful answers in terms of how you can actually improve in those skills. But knowing what skills you need to improve on is a really good place to start. So thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you guys next time.